Le Havre, August 25, 1944. Allied staff officers had run the numbers, and the conclusion was brutal in its simplicity and certainty. American armored columns pushing deep into liberated France would run out of fuel long before they reached any decisive position. The arithmetic was merciless. A single armored division required on the order of 250,000 liters of fuel per day to sustain offensive operations, and every mile of advance multiplied that demand. German generals, reading aerial photography and intercepted cables, mocked the idea that American logistics could keep up. They calculated distances, road capacities, and attrition rates and declared the advance unsustainable. What they did not count on was a logistics experiment that would convert industrial production into a moving supply line and rewrite those calculations. The Red Ball Express was about to prove the mockers wrong. In a matter of hours, a priority road network would be declared. Trucks would be requisitioned from civilian fleets, drivers would be drafted from among soldiers and civilians alike, and rules so simple and so rigid that they bordered on ritual would transform chaos into cadence. 26,000 drivers would supply 500,000 gallons a day. The operation would burn fuel to carry fuel. It would accept vehicle loss rates that would make any European army wince. And it would do all of this while revealing ugly truths about race, class, and command. Over the next hour, we will follow the plan from the table to the tarmac, the improvisations on the road, the reaction of enemy intelligence, the technical fixes that kept engines running, and the human stories that showed courage and contradiction. We will measure gains in miles per day, losses in vehicles, and the costs to men and communities. At the end, we will confront a statistic that looks like fiction and a legacy that shaped post-war transport and civil rights. This is the story of logistics turned strategy and of a force that moved supply and moved history at the same time. The plan began in a cramped map room behind a sandbagged window where Major James Reynolds and his staff leaned over a table stained with coffee and grease. The plan was not born from doctrine but from desperation and industrial logic. With depots still in Normandy and front lines inching east, the staff proposed a dedicated high-priority route between Cherbourg and the forward parks. The rule set was austere and almost liturgical. Trucks would run one way only, they would travel at fixed intervals, they would load at designated depots, and drivers would be rotated in shifts that ignored rank when exhaustion threatened. The meeting lasted 5 hours and included a terse exchange between Reynolds and Colonel Arthur Whitaker, who insisted on maintenance checkpoints every 200 miles. "We will break more trucks than we will spare men," Whitaker said. Reynolds replied, "Then we will break them faster and keep the line moving." The decision-makers formalized tonnage goals, windows for loading, and tight timing for convoys, and they set a priority code that stripped the operation of ambiguity. Technical specifications were written down. Each truck would carry an average of 300–400 kilograms of cargo, or roughly 3,000 liters of fuel. A convoy would aim for an average speed of 30 kilometers per hour, and routing would use 2 parallel road corridors to reduce congestion. Those numbers looked marginal on paper. They looked audacious in the field. The conception was an industrial answer to a tactical problem, and it required treating roads like assembly lines and drivers like factory hands. That change in mindset would be the operation's first innovation and its most controversial. Implementation began within 48 hours. Hundreds of trucks were painted with priority markings, and routes were flagged. At dawn, the first columns rolled out. Drivers like Elijah Turner and Robert Mills, who had been mechanics in civilian life, now sat behind military steering wheels and learned new rituals. They smelled diesel warmed by sun on the hood. They tasted dust and oil in the air, and felt vibration through their palms as they learned to keep precise separation intervals. Early days were brutal. Punctured tires, overloaded radiators, abandoned trailers, and wrong turns created bottlenecks that snarled supply. Mechanics such as Samuel Harris and Anna Garcia improvised mobile workshops under trees and beside culverts, swapping pistons, replacing radiators, and jury-rigging fuel lines by touch when there was no time for blueprints. Daily totals in the first week lagged behind goals, but the learning curve was steep. Drivers improvised informal hand signals to warn of traffic, and police officers were temporarily reassigned to clear intersections. The culture that formed in these first days was practical, blunt, and filled with small superstitions. A slogan emerged, painted on the side of a refueling point: "Keep the ball rolling." That slogan was more than poster. It was command doctrine simplified to 3 words, and every driver knew what it meant. The human composition of the force was striking and politically charged. Many drivers were young black soldiers from segregated units, including the 688th Quartermaster Truck Company and the 765th Trucking Battalion. Sergeant Henry Brooks had been a school teacher in Ohio before the draft. He drove a 3-ton truck that would become a lifeline for a forward armored brigade. Captain Walter Price handled routing and was one of the few white officers who consistently advocated for equal recognition of black drivers. In addition, there were European expatriates familiar with French roads, including André Dupont, who had immigrated to the United States years before and now navigated by memory of childhood lanes. Mechanics included Maria Lopez, a woman who had left a job in a shipyard to join the mobile maintenance teams, and Corporal Thomas Reed, who had been a rural garage owner and now performed engine swaps under canvas. Their interactions on the roads created a micro-society at once cooperative and tense. Racial segregation policies in American units still applied in mess halls and barracks, but on the road, necessity blurred those formal divisions. Slogans such as "keep the ball rolling" and informal rules like always checking the left front wheel before departure became cultural glue. This culture was improvisational yet rigid in practice, and that paradox helped the operation scale quickly. German intelligence did not ignore the columns. Lieutenant Karl Hoffmann, commander of a reconnaissance platoon in East Prussia, noted the priority markings on aerial photos and reported to his superiors in a dispatch that read like a mixture of bemusement and strategic concern. His report calculated that if the Allies sustained 400 trucks per day across the corridor, they could supply a forward thrust of 2 divisions for 15 days. Major Franz Becker, in a headquarters office, scoffed at the figures and ordered artillery units to target depots rather than roads. Early German response relied on interdiction through artillery, air attacks, and sabotage attempts by partisans. The Americans anticipated many of these moves and responded by diversifying routes, adding camouflage to parking areas, scheduling night runs, and creating redundancy in loading points. The enemy response later escalated to attempted ambushes on narrow passes. In one reported incident, a column led by Elijah Turner was stopped by a demolished bridge. Turner and his crew found themselves unloading fuel into smaller containers and ferrying it across with boats under intermittent shelling. Enemy reports often emphasized expected mechanical collapse, while field observations showed a different reality. The German staff had a model for logistical failure, and the Red Ball Express refused to conform to that model. Operational mechanics and innovations were at the heart of the success. Maintenance moved out from fixed depots to mobile units that followed the convoys. Teams of mechanics could remove an engine and install a rebuilt unit in the field in under 8 hours. They used cannibalization of less salvageable trucks to keep the line moving. Fuel consumption was monitored using simple but effective accounting. Kilometer by kilometer fuel tallies were kept on forms, and an average consumption factor was assigned per truck class. The operation favored redundancy over efficiency. If a route lost 30% of its trucks to breakdowns, the plan accepted that as long as alternating waves could fill the gap. Engineers installed temporary bridging to bypass destroyed structures, and artillery units assigned protection to vital junctions, but the core innovation remained disciplined volume. A process of continuous learning improved loading efficiency so that a tank receiving point could be serviced and back on the road in under 2 hours. Technicians like Samuel Harris developed quick change procedures for fuel pumps and radiators, writing them down on scrap paper that later became standard operating notes. This focus on processes and the willingness to accept high mechanical loss rates but low stoppage time made the operation resilient to both enemy action and sheer wear and tear. The tactical impact was immediate and measurable. Where previously advances had stalled at 25 kilometers per week, now armored formations routinely exceeded daily gains of 8 to 12 kilometers. In days of extreme push, some spearheads added 25 kilometers in a single 24-hour period. That additional mobility allowed commanders to seize road junctions and cut supply lines to isolated enemy garrisons. Tank battalions that seemed poised to exhaust their fuel rations were resupplied on the move and could maintain pressure on German defenses. Reports to Theater Command began to include a new variable: supply momentum. The Red Ball Express did not simply replenish stocks, it sustained an operational tempo previously deemed impossible. Field reports included names of days when entire armored brigades advanced 200 kilometers over 3 days thanks to continuous resupply. These were not isolated miracles, but emergent effects of an industrial logistic churn. Enemy plans based on attrition were undermined by relentless provisioning. The American ability to convert production capacity into forward fuel meant that rate of advance became a function of trucks, not just tanks. Yet success carried cost. Drivers and mechanics suffered wear injuries and deaths from crashes, attacks, heat, and sheer exhaustion. Sergeant Henry Brooks lost 2 comrades in a night convoy when a shell struck a parked fuel truck. Stories like his were repeated in towns along the route, where families gathered to hear of a son killed not on a battlefield but in a night accident while delivering fuel. Casualty statistics for the operation included non-combat fatalities that were proportionately higher than in some front-line units. The social implications were stark. Units that supplied the advance were often segregated and their sacrifices minimized in official narratives. Captain Walter Price wrote a memorandum urging recognition for mixed units and lamented the disparity in medals and commendations awarded to drivers of different races. Local civilian populations experienced the line differently. Farmers saw steady demand for labor and food, but also complained about road wear and requisition supplies. In one village, the smell of baking bread mixed with diesel and the sound of continuous engines became a new normal. The moral contradiction was visible. A society mobilized for liberty carried within its logistic miracle the inequities of segregation. The operation thus advanced not only territory, but also the conversation about who made modern war possible. There were concentrated moments of tension that felt like small battles. In one 2-paragraph sequence in a narrow valley, columns were pinned by artillery and drivers had to make a rapid decision to reroute or to press through under fire. The choice to reroute cost 18 hours and nearly 50 trucks in wear, but saved many lives. That decision was debated in quick, low-level exchanges among drivers and junior officers, with shouts and hand gestures and a mechanic wiping grease from his face shouting that the bridge ahead would not hold another ton. In a separate incident, a fuel depot caught fire and burned for 6 hours, a black column of smoke visible for miles, while men formed human chains to pass barrels away from the flames. The noise of falling timbers, the heat on their faces, the acrid smell of burning rubber entered the memory of survivors. And in a political crisis, a confrontation at a forward park between an insurgent group and convoy personnel escalated into a gunfight that left 3 civilians dead and forced commanders to introduce tighter security at troop supply points. Each of these moments forced adaptations that were codified into the operation and changed rules about convoy spacing, fuel handling, and security. At the center of the story is a backstory that explains why certain leaders made the choices they did. Major James Reynolds had been a logistics officer in the interwar period, overseeing a small motor transport company in Detroit. His early life included work in an automotive plant where he learned the rhythm of assembly lines and the logic of throughput. The first paragraph of his backstory recalls a childhood near a rail yard and the sensory memory of whistles and the metallic taste of cold air that made him equate movement with life. The second paragraph details his years as a reserve officer, where he wrote memos about the importance of redundancy and cross-training, often ignored by doctrinal purists. The third paragraph covers his wartime path to France, where he witnessed supply failures in Sicily and drew lessons about distribution versus storage. The fourth paragraph links these experiences to the moment of decision when he told his staff that volume would beat perfect efficiency. Together, these paragraphs paint a man formed by industry, comfortable with rules but open to improvisation, ready to trade broken vehicles for sustained motion, and willing to accept political blowback if the front moved forward. The backstory humanizes the tactical decision and explains the blend of engineer and manager that became vital to the operation. Secondary characters appear throughout the record, and each plays a distinct role. Sergeant Henry Brooks carries the human cost in small acts of care for grieving families. Captain Walter Price is the advocate who pushes for recognition. Samuel Harris is the pragmatic mechanic whose quick fixes keep wheels turning. Maria Lopez exemplifies the female technical contribution and the gendered reshaping of labor. Andre DuPont ties American logistics to local knowledge of roads and bridges. Lieutenant Carl Hoffman and Major Franz Becker represent the enemy perspective, their reports and miscalculations providing contrast. Corporal Thomas Reed brings rural mechanical expertise into an industrial operation. Corporal Anna Garcia coordinates field hospitals and casualty evacuation through logistic nodes. These named individuals populate dispatches, letters, and oral testimonies and show how many different persons made the operation possible. Technical descriptions are interspersed with personal narrative to maintain clarity. Fuel accounting relied on daily register forms in which clerks logged liters loaded, liters delivered, and estimated evaporation losses. Maintenance used a kit approach with pre-arranged spare parts for injector pumps, radiators, and drive shafts. Routing used road capacity curves that accounted for bridge weight, limits, and seasonal softening. Convoy discipline required pacing every 5 minutes to avoid crowding and a counting system to ensure redundancy. These procedural notes are precise yet explained in plain terms so that a viewer without a military background can understand how such measures scaled. Roughly 1/3 into this narrative, there is a moment to reflect and to invite discussion. If this story already feels unexpected, consider how many other logistic innovations are hidden behind wartime headlines. Which factor do you think mattered most in sustaining the line? Industrial production, disciplined manpower, simple rules, or the courage of those on the road? Write your answer starting with, "For me, it was," and explain in one sentence. The conversation helps us choose future topics and brings diverse perspectives into how we interpret operational success. Returning to the convoy, the next phase shows how the enemy adapted and how Americans hardened procedures in response. As the operation matured, the enemy increased efforts to interdict. Airstrikes attempted to break columns, but camouflage and dispersal reduced effectiveness. The Americans adapted by timing convoys for dawn and dusk, using local guides to avoid predictable choke points, and by establishing alternating schedule waves that made targeting ineffective. The learning process was continuous and recorded in after-action reports. One officer wrote that supply momentum had become a weapon. That phrase encapsulated a strategic insight. Logistics could itself be masked to create operational pressure. The Red Ball Express did not simply support operations, it enabled tempo that created strategic dilemmas for the German command. The cost calculation at the end of the run was both numerical and moral. Over 82 days, the operation moved an estimated 412,000 tons of supplies to forward units, including fuel, ammunition, and rations. Vehicle losses were high. Several thousand trucks required major repairs or were scrapped, and non-combat fatalities numbered in the hundreds. The operation accelerated the Allied advance and helped shape post-war infrastructure investment in highways and transport. It raised questions about recognition and equity, because many of those who bore the brunt of the risk were members of minority units whose contributions were under-recorded. Political fallout included debates in Congress about veteran recognition and proposals for compensation and revisions in unit commendation policies. The epilogue unfolds across time and shows the layered legacy. 1 month after the operation winding down, supply lines normalized and forward depots stabilized. Troops returned to garrison routines and many drivers went home to civilian jobs. But the immediate effect was operational relief. 3 months on, industrial planners and military logisticians studied the Red Ball Express as a case study. Doctrine began to incorporate principles of dedicated priority routes, mobile maintenance, and redundancy. Manuals were updated to emphasize tempo and continuous resupply over hoarded stockpiles. 6 months later, the social consequences became clearer. Advocacy groups pushed for better acknowledgement of minority service members. Some counties issued posthumous honors, and a few mechanized companies were reconstituted in new forms. The conversation about how industrial capacity can be harnessed under stress influenced post-war urban planning and the design of national highway systems. In the longer arc, the operation helped shift how armies viewed logistics from an auxiliary function to core strategy. Final numbers give sharp clarity and spark reflection. Tens of thousands of drivers moved millions of liters of fuel and thousands of tons of material, sustaining advances that would have otherwise bogged down. The arithmetic that German generals used to scoff proved incomplete because it treated logistics as a static pipeline rather than a mobilized industrial process. Strategically, the lesson is stark. Logistics can become a weapon when a society commits production, transport, and human sacrifice to a single operational aim. Morally, the operation exposed contradictions between ideals and practice because the human cost was disproportionately borne by those least likely to receive recognition. A war measure became a civil conversation. They did not simply move supplies, they moved the front and forced a nation to confront who did the moving. If this story moved you, consider subscribing to follow further investigations into other moments where industrial muscle and human courage reshaped history. They kept the ball rolling, and in doing so, they moved history itself.